Today, we're mapping out the totally tangled, feverish mind of Rodion Raskolnikov. You know him, the iconic protagonist of Fyodor Dostoevsky's psychological masterpiece, Crime and Punishment. We're really going to explore the devastating fallout of placing cold, hard intellect above basic human morality. And to track exactly how a mind justifies the unjustifiable, we've broken this massive, complex novel down into a minimalist, hand-drawn sketch note. As you can see on this visual mind map, we're tracking his arc across 5 distinct phases. We'll start with the mind of a murderer, dig into his extraordinary man theory, face the inescapable human conscience, look at the paralyzing effects of isolation and social injustice, and finally end up at redemption through suffering. Let's get into it.
Starting off with Part 1, the mind of a murderer.
Right, so to understand the crime itself, we first have to examine the incredibly dangerous logic brewing in our protagonist's isolated mind. Because long before the physical act actually happens, the murder is committed like 1,000 times in his thoughts. Just look at his internal monologue here. This is a man totally consumed by a hideous dream, yet he's completely paralyzed by indecision. I mean, he's a destitute former student living in this cramped, cupboard-like garret, literally hiding from his landlady because he's so deeply in debt. And he actually mocks his own cowardice. He points out the crazy irony that he wants to commit this monumental act, a thing like that, yet he's absolutely terrified of trivial everyday details, like wearing a hat that's too noticeable. It's a brilliant look at a mind completely at war with itself.
Now notice this utilitarian argument he overhears and just entirely latches onto. He listens to another student arguing that killing a wretched, abusive pawnbroker is mathematically justified, provided her hoarded wealth is used to save dozens of other lives from ruin. 1 death and 100 lives in exchange. It's framed as simple arithmetic, literally just math. And this strict, cold rationality, that becomes the exact seed that allows him to bypass his natural human aversion to taking a life.
Which brings us to Part 2, the extraordinary man theory. So, let's move to the real ideological core of his crime. Because Raskolnikov didn't just harbor these dark thoughts, he actually went and published an article detailing this exact worldview. The crucial thing to grasp here is his belief that humanity is fundamentally split into 2 distinct categories. He writes that certain elite individuals, the extraordinary men, possess this inner right, dictated purely by their own conscience, to overstep moral obstacles. Basically, if they need to shed blood to fulfill some grand, world-moving idea, they are completely justified in doing so.
And this setup brilliantly illustrates the dichotomy he creates to just bypass moral law altogether. On one side, you've got the ordinary masses. These are people bound by the law whose sole purpose is just to preserve the world and multiply. But on the other side, the extraordinary few, men like Napoleon. Raskolnikov argues that these movers of the world literally must be criminals to forge a new path. And really, he commits his crime in large part just trying to prove to himself that he belongs to this extraordinary elite.
But then, we hit Part 3, the inescapable human conscience.
Because almost immediately after the brutal act is actually committed, Dostoevsky masterfully dismantles all that cold rationality. The intellectual theory slams right into visceral reality. Raskolnikov desperately clings to his intellectual justification. He tries to convince himself, and later Sonia, that the victim was merely an insect, just a louse, a useless, loathsome, harmful creature. He is fighting tooth and nail here to maintain his stance that no true crime against humanity has even occurred.
But, well, his mind and body violently revolt against what he's done. He is suddenly tormented by intense paranoia, physical fever, and delirium. The absolute conviction that all his mental faculties are failing him becomes this insufferable torture. He realizes, with absolute horror, that the psychological breakdown he's experiencing, that is actually the real punishment beginning to take hold.
He discovers the hard way that you simply cannot reason away the fundamental moral law embedded within the human soul. The novel firmly posits that the human conscience is an inescapable judge, and honestly, it's far more punishing than the state itself could ever be. In fact, the psychological burden becomes so incredibly unbearable for him that when he finally gets his legal sentence of penal servitude, it actually comes as a physical relief.
Moving on to Part 4, isolation and social injustice.
Okay, so to truly understand his shattered mental state, we definitely have to contextualize the absolute pressure cooker of 19th century St. Petersburg happening all around him. Desperate poverty is just everywhere. The squalor and the terrible heat of the city are completely suffocating. I mean, we see the drunkard Marmeladov ruined by beggary, his wife Katerina driven to madness because she can't feed her kids, and his daughter Sonia forced into prostitution just to keep her family alive. Even Raskolnikov's own sister Dunya considers selling herself into a miserable marriage just to save him. Yet, and this is absolutely crucial, Dostoevsky is very careful to make a distinction here. While this environment perfectly explains the misery of everyone involved, it does not justify Raskolnikov's immorality. He even admits it himself. He didn't kill because he was hungry. He killed for his theory.
The true, ultimate punishment of his crime is this absolute, suffocating alienation from humanity. Now, even before the murder, he was isolating himself. But after shedding blood, that disconnect becomes absolute. Looking down at the river, he literally feels as though he has snipped the threads connecting him to the rest of the human race. He is completely, totally alone in his own theoretical universe.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Redemption Through Suffering.
For true salvation, he has to break out of this profound isolation. And the shrewd investigator Porfiry Petrovich sees right through him. He realizes that for Raskolnikov to heal, he has to abandon that heavy intellectual arrogance. Porfiry urges him to embrace his punishment, pointing out that suffering isn't merely a consequence of sin, it's actually the essential vehicle for spiritual purification. And Sonia echoes this entirely, practically begging him to accept his suffering to expiate his sin.
This massive internal struggle finally culminates in his confession to the authorities and, of course, the harsh physical reality of his punishment. In the epilogue, we find him confined for 9 months as a second-class convict in a Siberian prison, right on the banks of a broad, solitary river.
But crucially, he's not alone out there in Siberia. Think back to when he finally confessed his crime to Sonia earlier in the story. She didn't recoil in disgust. Instead, she embraced him with just boundless compassion. Her unwavering faith and selfless love stand in absolute stark contrast to his self-centered nihilism. She actually follows him all the way to Siberia, maintaining this quiet, enduring presence that just slowly chips away at his intellectual pride.
Finally, by bowing down to the earth, accepting his transgressions, and letting go of that failed theory that he was somehow an extraordinary man, he allows himself to be resurrected. The text beautifully notes that they were renewed by love. Raskolnikov finally discovers that human beings simply cannot survive by severing their connection to humanity.
So, what should you really take away from this explainer? It all comes back to this lingering question. Can intellect ever truly override the fundamental law of human morality? Dostoevsky's answer is a resounding no. Morality isn't just some social construct you can logic your way out of. It's the very fabric of the human soul. I really hope this exploration helped illuminate those dark, fascinating corners of Raskolnikov's mind. So think about it. Where do we see extraordinary man theories popping up in our own modern world today? And what might be the true cost of that kind of logic?